Hello, agentpreneurs, and welcome to episode 81 of the Daily List Report. As always, we've got a really interesting show for you today. We've got Stephen Brobeck. He is a senior fellow at the Consumer Federation of America. We're going to talk about a recent report that he's put out, and this is really all about how a consumer chooses a real estate agent. How many do they interview? How do they find an agent that they can trust? What review sites do they look at? And what advice we have for agents as you try to stand out and make sure that you are providing an authentic and trustworthy layer of information for consumers as they search for agents. So really excited to talk with him. While you're here, make sure you subscribe to our channel. Click the little bell to be notified of all of the great episodes here. There's 80 episodes before this that you hopefully will enjoy. So with that, I'm going to bring Steve on. Steve, why don't you say hello today to the agentpreneurs of ListReports?
Good morning. I'm very glad to join you, Randy, and also join all of your viewers.
Stephen, thank you so much for that. You know, you have, frankly, an incredible background, right? You were the executive director of the Consumer Federation of America for a long time. You were former faculty member at Case Western and had visiting professorships at University of Maryland, Cornell, etc. You have a PhD in American Studies from University of Pennsylvania. You obviously have had an incredible career. Can you spend just a couple minutes, Steve, and introduce yourself? Talk a little bit about what the Consumer Federation of America is and sort of your role in that as we get into this conversation.
Okay. Well, let me start with the Consumer Federation. We call ourselves CFA. We're an association of more than 250 nonprofit consumer groups that was established back in 1968 to advance the consumer interest through research, education, and advocacy. Now, our members are quite diverse. They include consumer reports, which I think everybody knows. They also include local consumer organizations, public interest research groups, local consumer education groups, and they include a large number of consumer cooperatives, credit unions, rural electric cooperatives, food co-ops, and so forth. Now, I first started working with CFA when I was a faculty member at Case Western. I was also a consumer advocate back then when I was in Cleveland. And I learned about the Consumer Federation in the mid 70s, and I persuaded our local consumer group to join CFA. After a year, I was elected to the board, and then several years later, they asked me to come on and work for them. And shortly after that, I was appointed executive director. Now, so I've actually had a lot of managerial responsibility for a long time until I retired as executive director just 2 years ago. I did start doing the real estate research back in the 1990s, in part because nobody else was really looking critically at the industry other than the Federal Trade Commission. It's our belief that, you know, every important consumer industry, and the real estate industry is a very important industry that confers a lot of value to consumers, needs, you know, outside assessment, even criticism from time to time. But basically, we have a fairly positive view of the industry. When you look at all of our research, you might ask the question, you do? But the fact is we do. And I have personally, and my wife has also, had a good experience with real estate agents.
Stephen, that's really helpful, right? So, you know, the CFA is this sort of broad collective. Is it funded by its members, or is it funded independently? Who backs the CFA?
Well, there's great diversity of funding sources, but the core funding is from our members. And then also foundation grants are important, conference revenues, the occasional cypre, which sometimes is quite sizable. So we're very diverse. We're well funded. You know, we're very financially stable organization, and but you know, our limitation is there are so many different consumer issues, so many different consumer products and services that's really a challenge to try to keep on top of everything.
Absolutely, I can only imagine. You know, Stephen, just because we touched on this right as we prepared for this call a couple years ago, and you're much more up to speed on this than I am, but the FTC and the DOJ held a workshop, right?
Hmm.
And it's been what? It's been 10 years or so, maybe more, since their last kind of major report on real estate. And I guess as I looked into this a couple years ago, I was expecting that. Is there another sort of major set of guidelines or guidance coming in the next year or so? And if so, I just think it's an interesting topic. Is there anything that we're expecting to see in that?
Well, all indications are that DOJ and FTC don't think the industry is sufficiently competitive.
Mm-hmm.
They are limited in what they can do. But I think really the where the action is going to be, the main action is going to be in the courts, the big lawsuits.
Yeah.
What was quite interesting was DOJ actually, in a way, supported the plaintiffs in rebuking the NAR for one of their claims that they were making. So, that could take years to finally resolve. But um, I've been dealing basically in consumer information, trying to educate and inform consumers and also encourage the industry and regulators to provide or ask the industry to provide more information about, say, agency representation, commissions, and so forth. But I would say the biggest change that might take place in the next 2 to 3 years, say, would be a fundamental restructuring of the industry, maybe even a decoupling of commissions so
Yes.
that both buyers and sellers would be able to negotiate their own commission. That would lead to, in our view, it would lead to a little bit of confusion during the transition, but ultimately it would lead to a more price competitive marketplace.
No, that makes sense, Stephen. And obviously, I think the litigation that you're referring to, right, that's ongoing right now is exactly for that purpose, right, to decouple those commissions where a buyer would pay the buyer's agent commissions and the seller would pay the seller's agent commissions. Stephen, as you look at the real estate industry, right, and I know you cover other industries as well, but as you've looked at real estate, you said you're positive on the industry, but that's okay, right? What's going on right now? This is a really interesting time for real estate as you think about COVID in particular, right? At least from our
Yes.
vantage point, which is there's it sometimes takes moments like this for kind of seismic change in how people do business. And we're looking at people advancing very quickly, doing remote work and virtual tours, and some really seismic changes in terms of how the industry is going to work, and acceleration towards digital closings, right, at the government level and at the private enterprise level. Do you have any thoughts on sort of what's happening right now from a consumer perspective and how coming through this time they may benefit, in fact, from some of these changes?
Well, I think the industry's been pretty quick on its feet in terms of adapting to the new realities, which I mean, none of us, I think, ever anticipated that we would experience in our lifetime.
No.
There are ways that there can be virtual buying. We've encouraged, for example, agents to consider walking people remotely through houses using cameras,
Mm-hmm.
allowing feedback from consumers, who are able then to say, could you show, the grouting in the around the bathtub, for
Sure.
example.
Yeah.
That it's not as good perhaps as a personal inspection, but it's not bad. And in some cases, actually, the consumer might be more thorough in examining the house, if they're just sort of, oh, well, here I am. I have about a half an hour to go through the house, so I can't look carefully at everything. And a number of agents, I think, in a very positive way, are trying out those communication vehicles, and I commend them for it. And the fact is that I think consumers over time will become more used to and comfortable with those new visual technologies,
Absolutely.
and hopefully sellers will not then be as reluctant to put their house on the market. I mean, that's the big, I think, roadblock right now is you have
Absolutely.
quite a lot of consumer demand. You just don't have adequate supply because, sellers, understandably, if they're still in the house, don't want dozens of people traipsing through, potentially with representing a
Absolutely.
safety threat. Yeah.
Without question. And I think that's, from our perspective, Stephen, that's one of the big changes that's going to persist, which is this idea that possibly the open house is dead, that this is going to go on long enough that people are not going to have people kind of traipsing through their house for long enough, that the Sunday open house, right, the traditional one where you've got the donuts and the pastries out, right, and people walk in and out of your house is probably gone. And the
Yeah.
challenge for an agent is that that was a tremendous source of lead generation for an agent, right? A chance to meet
Yes.
15, 20, 30, whatever people, get them on a
Yeah.
mailing list, have a conversation, and start to bring them into the funnel. So as we look at this, that lead generation has to be replaced somewhere else. And this gets us, I hope this dovetails nicely into one of our topics today, which is this report, right? So your
Yes.
report is choosing a real estate agent, an evaluation of information sources about quality of service. And for all of you listening right now, we're going to post a link to this report in the comments, so you don't have to remember that or write it down. We're gonna link that for you. But Stephen, now more than ever, think about this for a second, right? In the past, an agent would really rely on opportunities to meet consumers at an open house or a community service event or whatever. And now it's digital. And so consumers have always done increasingly digital research on people, but it's just very interesting to me. So can you talk about that maybe in the context of your report, right? Which is really all about agent reviews and a consumer's ability to find credible, authentic, trustworthy reviews of agents online. Maybe just introduce the report a little bit.
Yeah. Well, the remarkable thing is that most consumers don't do a very thorough search for agents. In fact, NAR's survey suggests that nearly half of all buyers and sellers um, just use the recommendation of a friend or relative or business associate, and then maybe just interview that one person. And there are good reasons for that that we can talk about. Nevertheless, this is a really important decision, not just because a lot of money is involved, but because the quality of service can vary greatly. You've got agents out there with years of experience, been involved in hundreds of different sales, are at their top of their game, work real hard, are committed. I'd much rather work with an agent with that background than someone who just, within 2 months got their real estate license and is really quite green and practically no experience in terms of buying and selling houses. So, you know, but the good news is there are information sources that consumers can access to learn a lot more about agents and potential quality of service. That's really the good news. The bad news is that consumers aren't fully utilizing those sources.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it is an interesting thing, right? And it's bewildering, to be honest with you, right? You're talking about a consumer who is embarking on most likely the largest financial transaction that they have made, right? Whether they're a first-time home buyer or a second time and they're upgrading, right? This is a lot of money, right? And I think you make that point in the report as a multiple of income, right? This is a massive transaction, and people are using agents more than ever. And yet, you're right, they don't spend a lot of time interviewing agents. But why do you think that is, Stephen? Why do you think that's the case, given the magnitude of this decision? I can speculate, but do you have a perspective on why that is?
Well, I think we can only speculate, but I think there's several reasons. One is because they're really preoccupied with the sale, you know, buying the house, selling the house, and the price that, the sale price of the house. They're really that, and that's understandable. They're
Yeah.
preoccupied with that. Secondly, they don't really understand the industry very well. I mean, the industry is sort of complicated. We did one study on agency that showed that there are 50 different terms that are used to define the relationship between the agent and the buyer or the seller.
Hmm.
Many of those terms were basically used for the same, to define the same relationship or identify the same consumer agent relationship, nevertheless. So, and it varies from state to state. So, consumers don't really understand, not just because the structure of the industry is a little complicated, but also because of the terminology, diverse terminology. And then I would say just also, there isn't, agents don't provide sufficient information, and consumers simply aren't aware that there are sources, namely Zillow's agent profiles. I must confess that
Hmm.
I wasn't really fully aware and did not appreciate the value of agent profiles until I started to do this research several months ago.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, Stephen. You know, here's what it makes me think. And again, we're speculating, and I'm not being articulate here because this is kind of a big thing to say, which is what concerns me about the data around how few agents a consumer interviews, right, before they make a selection, is that beyond maybe being distracted or confused or whatever about the process, is that at a fundamental level they don't appreciate and value the difference between one agent versus another agent. And so what worries me, and this has been a trend, right? So I'm just being honest here, as we know that as consumers have gone to the internet more, right? As the internet has enabled consumers to sort of take over some of the search aspect of finding a home, that has undermined some of at least the perceived value of what an agent does. Now, you could argue that in fact, the agent is very helpful during that part of the process. Certainly, the agent does a tremendous amount of work during the negotiation and the paperwork and all of those things, right? So there's a lot of things. We exist, frankly, as a company to serve agents, but it concerns me and I worry about it because I'm like, if a consumer is not interviewing 10 agents to make an informed decision, do they really value the difference between those 10 agents, or do they understand that there is a difference between those 10 agents, just in this example? So it's just something that's been on my mind for a long time, Stephen. I don't know if you have any thoughts on it, but it concerns me a little bit for agents.
Well, it's worrisome to me too. And in fact, the trend's sort of going in the wrong direction because, I mean, Zillow has provided, in my view, a lot of value to consumers. We don't like their overall ratings, but, we've been criticizing those for a couple of years. But nevertheless, they provide a lot of value. But on the other hand, because they supply information on basically all the homes that are on the market, and consumers then go and they search the database, which they should, and they get value from that, and then many of them will turn around and call the listing agent,
Mm, yeah.
not understanding that the listing agent is a fiduciary for the seller.
Mm-hmm.
And we've done some research on that as well. And I have to say, a quarter of the agents, and I pretended that I was a buyer,
Mm-hmm.
interested buyer, would say, "Look, I can't work with you. I can help you find another agent, but that's a conflict of interest." I give them credit. Um, Three-quarters of the agents that I called and talked to did not tell me that.
Of course.
So, I mean, that's worrisome. So that's actually, in a way, worse than getting a recommendation from a friend whose judgment you trust,
Mm-hmm.
because they had a good experience with an agent. When you're asking that listing agent to work with you, you don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, not only do you probably not understand the concept of agency, but you don't know whether that listing agent is any good or not.
Yeah.
And that's just another reason that consumers really need to do a search. Now, I will say that if you look at all the media and the press in this area, it's the advice is very general about interview several agents. It's not go in and look at their past sales experience. Go in and look at the customer reviews. And before you make a decision about which agents to interview.
So here's the thing for all of you watching right now. A lot of you watching are probably hearing Steven say Zillow, right? And that Zillow is a valuable service, and a lot of you are cringing, and I understand that, right? I deeply understand that. You have to understand this, and this is sort of the tough talk, right? We don't do a ton of tough talk here, but this is one of those moments, right, Steven? Services like Zillow, for all that agents resent, frankly, about them, this idea that they basically are holding listings hostage and they're charging you to be a part of that. I get that. The reality is that what Zillow has done, and Stephen, the work that you and the CFA are doing, is consumer advocacy, right? So internet companies have a long tradition of disrupting traditional industries by providing value to a consumer. So you can't ignore these things. So Stephen, as we talk about a consumer's need, frankly, to evaluate thoroughly multiple agents, to consider past sales, to consider their reviews, to identify sources of trustworthy reviews. These are things for all of you watching that you cannot ignore. You cannot turn a blind eye to this, because oftentimes, many times, the needs of the consumer is going to trump, right? If the consumer finds a better solution, they're going to adopt it. So the question is, make sure that you're aware of this. And the question becomes then, how do you survive and thrive in this environment? So Stephen, with that, I'm curious, as you went through this report, as you think about the role of an agent, which, by the way, right, and I think you quoted this also in your report, people are using real estate agents more than ever, which is great for the industry. There's no question that consumers need a trusted advisor in the process. What you're advocating for is that consumers make the best selection possible. So what is your advice to an agent out there who needs to make sure that they're relevant in the right ways to consumers? What should they be doing to make sure that they are a part of the solution here in terms of providing transparency and information to consumers as they search for an agent?
Yeah, I just would repeat. In other words, I would not buy or sell a house uh, without the help of a real estate agent. I mean,
Yes.
that's how valuable I think they are. I understand, um, the marketplace and buying and selling better than the average consumer, but I would not do it on my own.
Yeah.
So, and that's why, in the last 15, 20 years, the percentage of people who were using an agent according to one set of surveys has gone from 80% to 90%. That does not surprise me at all. So
Yeah.
now to address your question, what can agents do? Well, first of all, you're going to have to live with third-party information sources because they simply are more objective. Now, you have a lot of influence over that information. Most of the customer reviews you generate.
Yes.
And the reason, of course, we like the Zillow reviews better than the agent website reviews is that they're not really they're not curated. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you as an agent would really be foolish because it's really marketing.
Yeah.
Be foolish to put on a negative review. You you
Right.
you would put that on your website. But if you in fact encourage your past clients to write reviews, and one of them has some criticism, they're very rarely a completely negative review.
Yeah.
That Zillow has.
Mm-hmm.
And some have argued that if you have 50 reviews and one's negative, that adds credibility
It
to the other
does. It
49.
makes
So
it feel more real. I agree.
really get too upset about that one negative review. Consumers make mistakes too.
Yeah.
So, and we recognize that at CFA. But I would say, okay, accept the fact that third party sources, exist, and don't get upset about that. And then provide consumers with as much information as you can. I would say, I mean, there is a real effort to include customer reviews among many of the active agents, and that's good. A number of agents are actually linking to the Zillow reviews. That's
Yes.
even better. That's more credible. And then, but what most agents don't do is include enough information about past sales, and that includes not just um, the the address of and the price of the house. That should also include your role as the agent. Did I work with the buyer, the seller? Was I a facilitator or dual agent? What was my role there? And especially, what was the date of the sale? I mean, we're encouraging consumers to look at that sales data to see how active you've been, not just over even decades, but just recently. And 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 most consumers, including myself, would be more likely to work with an agent who's been very active recently, who's had experience, and presumably that experience has led to knowledge and a better ability to represent me or to provide the best value for the customer.
Absolutely. Stephen, no, I think that's really, really well said. And I appreciate you coming on the show today. You're actually the first person that we've had come on the show, now episode 81, from a consumer advocacy group who's really thinking, all day, every day about what is in the best interest of the consumer. And it's frankly a great reminder, Stephen, to our agents who ostensibly exist to serve their consumers, right? But sometimes I think it's easy to get lost in a lot of the other things that are happening in the industry because there's a lot that's going on. And so I think this is a good reminder, and I think, groups like yours, keep everybody honest, right? I think that's the point. And I appreciate you taking the time today to do this. Is there anything that I missed? Is there anything else that you wanted to cover, Stephen, before we wrap up for the day?
Well, I would say that the most important thing an agent can do is actually provide great customer service.
Yes,
Because if
agreed.
you do that, the word of mouth is going to be effective. It's going to get around, and not only that, you'll get better customer reviews. Now, to be fair, I think that most agents know that, and
Yes.
I see, over the last 5 to 10 years, you've seen a great increase in the number of consumers, number of agents that will seek customer reviews and will put other information online. And that, so it's a positive direction, but still, the better here.
I couldn't agree more. That's fantastic. Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with our agents today about this report. Again, we're going to link to that report in the comments, and I hope that we get a chance to talk with you again real soon.
Thank you. I enjoy talking to you, Randy, and um, I think it's been fun and it's been helpful to me.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephen. We'll talk to you real soon.
Okay, bye bye.
Well, that's fantastic. So again, here's the report, choosing a real estate agent and evaluation of information sources about quality of service. We're going to link to that in the comments. Make sure that you check that out. I think we touched on a lot of really important things today. And one of the things that I continue to try to hammer home, right, is that as the market changes, you have to be aware of these things and you have to be out ahead of them. I know it's exhausting. I know it's difficult to do that. But as we talked about during this COVID time, what an opportunity, in spite of the tragedy, to reinvent yourself, to take advantage of some of the new technologies, to be relevant to your sphere in ways that are reassuring and informative and helpful, right, as everybody goes through this massive period of uncertainty. But now we have to also look a little bit further ahead, right? We have to look at this issue of dual agency, and that's been blocked in a lot of places, that almost certainly will be blocked in most places. This idea of breaking up the commissions so that the seller pays the seller's agent, the buyer pays the buyer's agent. Looking at reports like this and understanding deeply about the need for a consumer to have access to fair and accurate and honest and transparent information as they make their selection. So these are trends that sort of exist at a layer beneath sort of our day-to-day business, but these are important things. And to the extent that you can adopt them, to the extent that you can adopt an attitude, as we like to do at List Reports, which is we're highly transparent, right? As Stephen said, a bad review is not a bad thing. Even in this show, and I know this is not the same thing, if I make a mistake, oftentimes I don't re-record it, right? Because we're all fallible and there's something that's human about that, right? So if you've got mostly good reviews and you've got a bad review, that speaks to the fact, as we talked about last week with one of our guests, is as you build your brand, as you establish who you are, it's not going to work for everyone, and that's okay, right? So I said a lot there. We're going to wrap the show for today. Check out this report. Be thoughtful about what's coming, not just what's happening now. And I know it's overwhelming, but we're here to help you as much as we can. So until tomorrow, be safe, be healthy, be happy, and we'll see you soon.